Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where we appreciate the handful of you who keep coming back week after week. The rest don't know what they're missing. The 1980s were a special time in human history. Popular entertainment from the decade is still relevant today, and so is the excessive amount of chaos, suffering, and death that occurred throughout the decade. In this episode, we are going to take a look at a few of the worst and least remembered events of 1988. Let's start with a story about illegal dumping. Khian Sea disposal incident. Starting in the 1970s, the city of Philadelphia began burning much of its trash in an incinerator. This produced a lot of ash. For over a decade, the city sent this ash to New Jersey, where it was buried in a landfill. In 1984, New Jersey tested the ash and realized it contained a high concentration of heavy metals that were toxic to humans. New Jersey refused to accept any more shipments. This left Philadelphia with a massive problem as they produced 180,000 tons of the dangerous material every year. In 1986, the city hired a company to dispose of the trash. This company in turn hired another company, and they hired a cargo ship called the Khian Sea. On August 31st, the ship took on 14,000 pounds of ash and left for the Bahamas. The environmental group Greenpeace warned the Bahamas about the toxic ash being brought to the islands. The Khian Sea was turned away by several countries, including the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Panama, Bermuda, Guinea-Bissau, and the Dutch Antilles. The cargo vessel spent the next 14 months trying to find somewhere to accept the shipment. Nobody would take it, and as a result, the ship's owners couldn't get paid. In December 1987, the crew of the Khian Sea told Haiti that the cargo was fertilizer. The crew unloaded 4,000 pounds of ash onto a beach before the government realized what was happening. They ordered the crew to return the ash to their ship, but the Khian Sea left that night. The pile of toxic waste was left on the beach. For the next 11 months, the ship tried to find a place to take the remaining 10,000 pounds of ash. No country was willing to accept it, but in November 1988, the Khian Sea showed up at a port in Singapore and all of its dangerous cargo was gone. Authorities discovered that the ship illegally dumped thousands of pounds of ash into the ocean. The owners were convicted of perjury. The Khian Sea was finally scrapped in 1992. In 2000, the remaining ash in Haiti was loaded on a ship and taken to Pennsylvania. It was buried in a landfill. Black Sea bumping incident. The United States and the Soviet Union had several disagreements. In one case, it resulted in two ships colliding. In 1979, the United States government reported that several nations were trying to claim exclusive rights to international waters beyond their boundaries. To address this, the US Navy started purposely traveling through disputed areas. On March 13, 1986, the USS Yorktown and the USS Karen attempted to enter waters near the Crimean Peninsula. It resulted in a standoff with Soviet vessels. Eventually, the US ships turned around and the crisis was averted. The Soviet government decided that if this happened again, they were within their rights to force the US out of the area. On February 12, 1988, the Yorktown and the Karen were sent into the Black Sea again. As they passed within 8 miles of Soviet territory, the U.S. ships were met by 2 Soviet frigates. The frigates bumped Yorktown and Karen, trying to force them out of what the Soviets considered their territory. The USS Karen was undamaged other than scratches on the paint, but the USS Yorktown suffered damage to 2 missile canisters. Despite being bumped, the U.S. ships never veered off course. In 1989, the United States and the Soviet Union reached an agreement that prevented a similar incident from happening again. Kidnapping a Colonel. William Higgins was born in Danville, Kentucky on January 15, 1945. He joined the Marines in 1967 and served in Vietnam. William remained in the military after the conflict ended, and by 1985 he was serving in the office of the Secretary of Defense. In July 1987, he was transferred to a United Nations assignment. Shortly after that, he was sent to Lebanon. His role was to observe the United Nations peacekeeping troops in the Middle East. On February 17, 1988, William Higgins was driving alone on a coastal highway in southern Lebanon. A car pulled out in front of him and stopped. Then armed men, some of whom were from Hezbollah, pulled him from the vehicle at gunpoint. He was tortured and interrogated for weeks. On April 21, black and white photos of William Higgins were sent to news agencies, along with a statement that he would be tried as a war criminal. Rumors began circulating that William was already dead. On July 21, 1989, it was finally confirmed. A videotape was released showing William being executed by hanging. The terrorists claimed it was in retaliation for Hezbollah leader Abdul Karim Obeid being killed by Israeli commandos a few days earlier. William's body wasn't recovered until 1990. When his remains were returned to the United States, investigators discovered that the terrorists were lying. It appeared that William was killed by cuts to his throat, most likely in 1988. William's wife filed a lawsuit against Iran as they financially supported Hezbollah. The Islamic Republic was ordered to pay $55 million as compensation. Iran Air Flight 655. The latter half of the 1980s saw numerous conflicts between the United States and Iran. For much of the decade, Iran and Iraq were at war with each other. Iran attacked a U.S. Navy frigate in 1987, and in early 1988, the Navy responded by sinking several Iranian ships, as well as 2 oil drilling platforms. The United States military warned pilots who flew civilian aircraft throughout the Persian Gulf that they needed to be prepared to identify themselves upon request. Failure to do so could have deadly consequences. Enforcing security in the region stretched the Navy thin. They sent a single cruiser, USS Vincennes, to help keep the peace. On July 3, 1988, Iran Air Flight 655 was preparing to leave. It took off from Tehran around 10:17 a.m. The airplane was scheduled to fly over the Persian Gulf and into Dubai. Usually the flight would take about 30 minutes. Earlier that morning, a helicopter that took off from USS Vincennes came under fire from several Iranian gunboats. The Iranian boats were in international waters. The captain of the Vincennes pursued the attackers until they returned to Iran's territory. After this, the ship's crew was on high alert. According to personnel on the U.S. Navy cruiser, they detected a transmission on a channel reserved for F-14 Tomcats. These were fighter aircraft that Iran had purchased, and they had the potential to destroy American ships. 10 separate attempts were made to contact the plane. The pilots never responded. The enemy attack plane was actually Iran Air Flight 655. When it came within 10 miles of USS Vincennes, the cruiser fired 2 surface-to-air missiles. They both hit the airplane, causing it to disintegrate in midair. All 290 people aboard were killed. When the U.S. military investigated the event, they discovered that although the crew of Vincennes claimed that their systems detected an F-14, the recorded data clearly showed that the airplane was broadcasting on civilian frequencies. The United States government eventually admitted fault for the disaster and paid $131 million in damages. Walsh Street Murders. Being an Australian police officer was dangerous in the 1980s. The state of Victoria saw several attacks on police throughout the decade. In 1985, an officer was killed during a shootout. In 1986, a bombing killed an Australian policewoman named Angela Rose Taylor. The end of the decade saw even more violence against police officers. On October 11, 1988, Graham Jensen went to a nearby store. While he was inside, police surrounded the building. They wanted to arrest him for armed robbery and murder. Jensen jumped in his car and tried to get away. He was shot and killed during the escape attempt. Graham's best friend was Victor Pierce. Victor was part of a gang called the Flemington Crew. They also had a habit of stealing and killing. On October 12, just a few hours after Graham Jensen was killed, constables Stephen Tynan and Damian Eyre received a call about an abandoned Holden Commodore. They drove to the location, exited their vehicle, and began inspecting the car. Stephen was killed with a shotgun. Damian was executed with a shot to the back of the head. The killer used Damian's own service revolver in the murder. The police immediately suspected Victor and his crew were responsible. They raided Victor's house. Then they arrested Victor and his 3 friends, who were believed to be accomplices. Victor's wife, Wendy, agreed to enter witness protection and testify against her husband, but she changed her mind at the last minute. She was charged with perjury and sentenced to 9 months. Ultimately, the government couldn't prove its case. Due to a lack of evidence, Victor and his accomplices were acquitted. Nobody was ever charged for the murders of the 2 constables. The Great Worm. As the 1980s progressed, the Internet began to emerge. It mainly existed to connect certain institutions, such as universities, banks, and the United States federal government. The new infrastructure was significant enough that a law was passed in 1986 called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. For the first time, it explicitly made attacking critical computer systems illegal. Robert Morris was 22 years old in 1988. He had recently finished his undergraduate studies at Harvard. Then he entered the graduate program at Cornell University. University computers during the 1980s used the Unix operating system. There were several security vulnerabilities in the operating system, and they weren't getting fixed fast enough to suit Robert. So to help spotlight the problem, on November 2, 1988, he wrote the first computer worm. The Morris worm, as it would later be known, exploited vulnerabilities in several Unix programs. The worm didn't do any specific damage, but it would check to see if it should copy itself periodically. Robert instructed the worm to copy itself 14% of the time, no matter what. When he decided to test this new creation, there was just one problem. The infected computers were connected to the Internet. The Morris worm spread like wildfire, infiltrating networks all over the country. The infected computers became almost completely unusable as their resources were dedicated to propagating the virus. The virus was finally eliminated, but it took great effort and expense. Robert Morris became the first person to be prosecuted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. He was put on trial and convicted of causing thousands of dollars of damage. He appealed in 1991, and the court upheld the verdict. Robert later went on to found a successful company which he sold for millions of dollars. In the 1980s, the economy was growing, and business was also booming for the Grim Reaper. Which events we covered today did you find the most interesting? Did we miss anything that you think was important? If so, let us know about it in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the final episode in this series. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.